The ghost ship. It was just an ordinary fishing vessel, the Dragonfly, cutting through the cold waters of the North Sea. The crew of 4, Captain Stone, Sailor Mark, young Thomas, and Old Jack, were used to the harsh conditions. The sea was their home, and when night fell, everything was as it should be. The silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves and the occasional squawk of seagulls trailing behind the boat. And then it came, a distress signal. It was unmistakably from an abandoned ship, far beyond the usual fishing grounds. No one knew where it had come from. Captain Stone hesitated for a moment, considering ignoring it. The sea was unpredictable, and they could always return to shore. But something inside him pushed him to decide otherwise. It was instinct. "We'll stop," Captain Stone declared. "We'll see what's going on. Someone might be in trouble." And so, the boat that was supposed to head home veered off course toward the mysterious location the signal had come from. They saw nothing but darkness, rolling waves, and a howling wind. And then they saw it, the silhouette of a ship rising above the water. It didn't look like any ordinary fishing boat. As they drew closer, a strange mist began to surround their vessel. The temperature suddenly dropped. A chill crept into their bones. The old ship, whose name had long been erased, stood still, as though it had never moved. Everything around it was unnervingly quiet. "There's something wrong here," Jack said, his usually calm voice now tinged with unease. "It's like we're being watched." The crew's hearts began to pound, but despite the fear creeping up their spines, they were determined to board and find out what was going on. Captain Stone gave the order to tie ropes and climb aboard the decaying ship. Inside, it was empty. The cabins were deserted, but something about it felt off. The walls were covered in mold and dust, windows obscured by layers of grime. But it wasn't the complete silence they expected. The air in the ship's corridors was thick, heavy, like with every step they took, they were breathing in the faint moans of a forgotten past. "There's nothing here," Mark said. "Weird. Too quiet. Let's check the lower decks." As they made their way down, the ship's creaking seemed to grow louder, almost as if the vessel itself was waking up. Their footsteps echoed off the dark walls, and the low, unnatural hum of something long forgotten seemed to seep into their bones. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Then a door slammed shut behind them. They spun around, but no one was there. A shiver ran down their spines. "What was that?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. They continued deeper into the ship, passing rooms that looked like they had been abandoned decades ago. Or was it just yesterday? Time on this ghost ship didn't seem to flow normally. The further they went, the more the ship began to feel alive. Then they heard it, a soft, slow dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the floor. It came from the direction of the lower hold. Captain Stone motioned for everyone to stay quiet. The sound was unmistakable. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something or someone was moving below them. They reached the hold's door. The air was musty, thick with the smell of rot. As Captain Stone slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open, a voice, barely a whisper, echoed through the room. "Leave now. Leave while you still can." A cold gust of air burst through the door, nearly knocking them back. But they forced themselves inside, the sound of their boots crunching against the floor. They saw the shadow of something in the far corner, but it didn't look right. It was there, but not quite. Before they could react, a form emerged from the darkness. A figure, gaunt and pale, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes hollow and unblinking. It reached out with long, spindly fingers. And then the ship screamed, a terrible, soul-piercing shriek that rattled their teeth and rattled their very souls. The walls around them seemed to bend and twist as if the ship itself was alive, desperate to claim them as part of its forgotten crew. The crew scrambled, running, but the ship was no longer the same. Hallways twisted, rooms turned upside down. Time didn't make sense. The world outside the ship seemed to disappear, replaced by an endless void of darkness. One by one they fell, lost to the ship's curse, their voices, their struggles, swallowed by the ship that had waited so long for new souls. And then it was silent. No more distress signals. No more crew. Just the ship, waiting, drifting, waiting for the next ship to come close enough. The Dragonfly was now the ghost ship, and somewhere, in its shadowy depths, the lost souls of the crew still roamed, never aging, never leaving, always waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers. And it wouldn't be long before another boat passed by. Next story. The Cursed Cargo. The Endurance was an old freighter, its once gleaming steel hull now rusted and worn from years of service on the open ocean. It had been bought by a small shipping company that specialized in obscure and high-risk deliveries. The crew, a mix of seasoned sailors and young men eager to prove themselves, had just embarked on a long haul across the Pacific. Their cargo, a mysterious shipment that had come with no explanation. Captain Grant, a grizzled veteran of the seas, was the first to notice that something wasn't quite right. The shipment had been loaded in complete secrecy, guarded by men who refused to answer any questions about its contents. It was secured deep in the hold, wrapped in thick, tar-covered crates that appeared to have been handled with the utmost care. The ship's manifest didn't contain any information about the cargo, only the location where it was to be delivered. The first day of the voyage passed without incident, but by the second day, things started to go wrong. The first sailor to disappear was Thomas, a young deckhand. He was last seen on his watch, staring out over the sea, but by morning he was gone. No one could explain where he had gone or how he could have vanished. His belongings were still in his quarters, and there were no signs of struggle. Captain Grant ordered a search of the ship, but no trace of Thomas was found. As the days passed, the crew grew anxious. The ship's radio seemed to malfunction at random, and strange noises echoed from the hold. Scratching sounds, faint whispers, and the occasional thud, as if something were moving within the crates. Then, one by one, other sailors began to vanish. First, it was John the cook, then Robert the engineer. They disappeared without a trace, leaving no clues behind, no signs of their struggles. The remaining crew members were terrified, but it wasn't just the disappearances that shook them. Something darker had begun to unfold. Those who stayed behind began to experience horrific hallucinations. It started with small things, shadows lurking at the edges of their vision, strange flashes of movement, and the feeling that someone or something was watching them from the depths of the ship. But it didn't take long before the hallucinations became more intense, more vivid. Sailors would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, seeing grotesque, twisted faces staring back at them from the walls. Some would hear voices calling their names. Others claimed to see entire scenes of destruction. Visions of cities being consumed by flames, of the ocean boiling with fury. Captain Grant, desperate to keep his crew together, locked himself in the bridge and ordered no one to go near the hold. But it was too late. It was during one of his late-night shifts that he heard it. The scratching, a constant, frantic noise coming from deep below. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped outside, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the hold. As he descended the stairs, the air grew thick and oppressive, and the scratching grew louder. When he reached the door to the cargo hold, he hesitated. The sounds from within were almost deafening, like something was trying to escape. He could feel a cold sweat forming on his brow as he slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the crates were shaking violently, as though something inside was thrashing against them. The air was heavy with a suffocating, acrid smell, a mixture of decay and something foul. As the light from his flashlight swept across the room, Captain Grant's blood ran cold. The crates were cracked open, and what had once been tightly sealed was now spilling out. From the dark corners of the room, the cargo revealed itself, a mass of twisted, rotting corpses, their eyes wide open in eternal terror. But they weren't just dead bodies. They were moving. The bodies were still alive, somehow, their skin stretched and warped as if their very souls had been consumed by something ancient, something beyond comprehension. A voice echoed from the depths of the room, a voice that was not human. It spoke in a language that sent shivers down Grant's spine, words that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. We are the forgotten. We are the lost. And now, you carry us to our doom. The sailors who had stayed aboard began to scream, collapsing to the ground as the hallucinations grew worse. Some clawed at their faces. Others tore at their own skin, trying to escape the horrors they were seeing. The ship seemed to come alive, creaking and groaning, as if it too were suffering. Captain Grant stumbled backward, his mind reeling from the grotesque vision before him. He realized with a sickening certainty what they had been carrying. This wasn't just a shipment of bodies. This was something far worse. Something that should have stayed buried on the ocean floor for eternity. The cargo was cursed, and now it was awake. The Endurance began to list, tilting dangerously as the crew's sanity slipped away. The last of the sailors, including Captain Grant, vanished without a trace, their screams lost in the chaos of the storm that rose around the ship. The freighter drifted aimlessly across the sea, its ghostly presence a warning to any who might cross its path. It was a ship with no destination, carrying a curse that could never be undone. And the cargo? It remained, waiting to be buried once again. Next story. The Last Passenger. The Elysium was a grand luxury cruise ship, its hull gleaming under the sun as it gently rocked back and forth on the waves of the Atlantic. After weeks of travel, the ship was finally returning to port. The passengers were excited to disembark, eager to reunite with family and friends, share stories of their adventures, and leave the open sea behind. Captain Harris stood at the bridge, surveying the calm waters as the ship slowly approached the harbor. It had been a smooth journey, a trip that promised relaxation and indulgence. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. Once the ship docked, the crew began preparing for the passengers to disembark, but Captain Harris had a routine. Before allowing anyone off the ship, he always performed one last check to ensure everything was in order. He gathered the manifest of passengers, those who had boarded the ship and were registered for the voyage, and began his review. As he flipped through the list, a name caught his eye. There was someone listed who he didn't recognize. It was just one name at the very bottom of the list, Elijah Quinn. Captain Harris frowned. He had checked and rechecked the passenger list before the voyage had started. Elijah Quinn had not been there. He didn't recall seeing anyone by that name when they had boarded, and no one on the crew seemed to remember him. Must be a mistake, Harris muttered to himself. He called down to the passenger service desk to confirm, but there was no sign of this mysterious passenger. There was no record of Elijah Quinn on any documents from boarding. Determined to resolve the issue, Harris ordered a search of the ship. Crew members combed through the cabins, hallways, and common areas. Yet there was no sign of anyone named Elijah Quinn. But as they scoured the ship, a strange tension filled the air. The crew was on edge. How could someone have boarded without anyone remembering? Could it be a mistake? Was there a stowaway hiding somewhere on the ship? Hours passed, but there was still no sign of him. Harris was growing increasingly unsettled. As night fell, he personally checked the cabins again, starting from the lower decks and working his way up. When he reached the first-class suites, something felt different. A coldness lingered in the air, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. Then, as he approached a cabin near the aft of the ship, a door creaked open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn shut. But what struck him most was a figure standing by the window, staring out into the black sea. "Who are you?" Captain Harris asked, his voice betraying the unease he felt. The figure slowly turned. The man was tall, pale, and gaunt, his face almost expressionless, save for his eyes, dark, hollow, and disturbingly empty. "I'm Elijah Quinn," the man replied, his voice cold and distant. Captain Harris's heart skipped a beat. There was something wrong with this man. Something in the air felt oppressive, unnatural. "Why haven't we seen you before?" Harris asked, stepping forward cautiously. "How did you get on board?" But Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something that Captain Harris couldn't hear. The room suddenly felt heavier. The walls seemed to close in, and the air became thick and suffocating. "I don't belong here," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Captain Harris could respond, the man took a step back into the shadows of the room. Harris stepped forward to grab him, but when he reached the spot where Elijah had been standing, the man was gone. Confused, terrified, and overwhelmed with a sense of dread, Captain Harris ran to the ship's control room. He called for the security team to find Elijah Quinn, but no one could find him. The crew checked every nook and cranny of the Elysium. It was as if Elijah had never existed. Panic began to spread throughout the crew. How could someone have disappeared without a trace? How could someone have been on the ship all this time without anyone noticing? Then, as the last passengers filed off the ship, Captain Harris noticed something on the deck. A small, tattered suitcase lying on the ground near the gangway. His blood ran cold as he approached it. The name Elijah Quinn written in faded letters across the side. With trembling hands, Captain Harris opened the suitcase. Inside, there was nothing but a single, yellowed newspaper clipping. It read, "Man found dead aboard luxury cruise liner. Cause of death unknown. Authorities have no explanation for the mysterious passenger who boarded the ship and vanished without a trace." The article had been written years ago, and then the horrifying realization struck him. Elijah Quinn had never boarded the Elysium. He had never been a passenger. He had never been alive. The ship had